You can have available, affordable housing, or you can have mass, uncontrolled immigration. You can't have both. Hey guys, welcome back to GB News. It's Matt Goodwin. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now, I'm going to say something controversial. When it comes to Britain's housing crisis, Nigel FARAGE is right. We have to talk about the link between mass immigration and our unfolding housing crisis. Check out this clip.
Good evening. Well, in common with the last government, there is a target to build 1.5 million homes during the lifetime of this parliament. It's just that Labour seem to be rather more determined to do it because they are quite prepared to totally override local district, county councils, local unitary authorities. They are just going to do it. And this includes redefinitions of what counts as green belt land. Some of it potentially being designated as being grey belt. Now, if this comes to disused garages or empty car parks or vacant pubs, well, you might say that all makes sense. But there will be, especially across the home counties, real, genuine worry about what it means for green spaces, about what it means for gaps in between villages. And by the way, when all these houses get built, there'll be no more GPs, no more school places, no more roads. No, your quality of life will diminish directly as a result of this. Now, whether they can actually meet the target, I very much doubt, without importing huge amounts of foreign labour, which of course in turn will mean even more demand for houses. Right now, we have to provide one new home every 2 minutes just to keep pace with levels of immigration in this country. So the truth of it is, we must build every greenbelt land all over our nation just to house those that have come into this country in the course of the last 10 years. However, we have a serious housing shortage. What are we to do?
Now, Farage is absolutely right. In recent years, the UK has grappled with an increasingly severe housing crisis, characterised by soaring property prices, rental costs, and a shortage of affordable and available homes. While various factors are contributing to this crisis, one significant driver, often overlooked in Westminster, often overlooked among the elite class, is the impact of mass immigration on the housing crisis. Now, I want to explore in this short video the intricate relationship between immigration and housing, shedding light on why I think figures like Nigel Farage are right to argue that mass, uncontrolled, unprecedented immigration is driving this enormous crisis facing our nation. Now, to understand the impact of immigration on housing, we must first examine the scale of immigration into the country in recent years, because it's simply been staggering. Now, over the last couple of years, net migration into the country reached a record historic high of nearly 1 million people, more than 900,000. This figure surpassed previous estimates. It's the highest on record, highlighting the unprecedented scale of migration. In the last few years alone, around 2.5 million people have been added to Britain's population. That's equivalent to 2 cities the size of Birmingham. Now, if you look at official forecasts, they suggest that net migration going forward could remain above 500,000 every year. That means 500,000 more people being added to the population every year than the number who are leaving. This is absolutely astonishing. These numbers represent a significant influx of people, all of whom will require housing, and this will place immense pressure on an already strained property market. The UK's housing crisis is characterised by a chronic undersupply of homes. The government's target of building 300,000 new homes annually has consistently been missed. If you look at recent years, for example, in 2022, only 232,000 new homes were completed in England and Wales, falling short of the target by over 67,000 homes. The cumulative housing deficit has grown over decades, with some estimates suggesting a shortfall of millions of homes. This persistent undersupply of homes in Britain, coupled with rapid population growth, fueled by mass immigration, which is now the only thing expanding our population over time because the number of deaths are now exceeding the number of births among the British population. Mass immigration is the only driver of our population growth. This has created a perfect storm in the housing market. It's created an almighty crisis. Just listen to some of these astonishing numbers. If net migration into Britain every year remains at around 500,000 people, meaning 500,000 more people are coming into the country than leaving, this equates to a need for approximately 200,000 new homes every year just to accommodate new arrivals. In fact, the Centre for Policy Studies, a respected think tank in Westminster, suggests the figure could be even higher. They published a report earlier this year suggesting that we need to build around 550,000 homes a year just to keep up with the historic demand left by mass immigration in the past. In other words, we've got an enormous crisis brewing. And Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer and his Housing Minister Angela Rayner have just said, well, they're going to build 1.5 million new homes by 2029, often building on the Green Belt, often demolishing and destroying our wonderful countryside. But here's the thing, more than half of those new homes, about 800,000 it's estimated, are going to be needed to keep up with the demand from immigration. This is underlining the sheer scale of the crisis that's unfolding before our very eyes. So why is this crisis being overlooked by much of Westminster and the elite class? Well, despite the very clear link between mass immigration and the housing crisis, this aspect of the crisis often goes undiscussed in mainstream political discourse. Why? Well, we all know why. Firstly, because of political correctness. Everybody in Westminster is scared of being called a xenophobe or a racist, and this stifles open, serious debate about the impact of immigration on our public services, housing and infrastructure. Secondly, because of economic arguments. People who support mass immigration often argue that it's having an economic benefit by filling labour shortages, for example, and they downplay its strain on public services and housing. But this argument is nonsensical. As I've shown before, mass uncontrolled immigration is having profoundly negative effects on our economy, not only our housing crisis. In fact, even the Office for Budget Responsibility has been forced to concede that for every low-wage, low-skill migrant coming into the country today, that's costing you, the British taxpayer, between £150,000 and £1 million, just before we get to housing, the NHS, and all the other things. And thirdly, there's just a lot of short-term thinking in Westminster in the two big parties. Politicians and policymakers are often focusing just on the immediate Parliament, on the next 4 or 5 years, rather than our long-term needs when it comes to infrastructure and housing. If you look at all of the government forecasts, they paint an astonishing picture over the coming decades. I'll give you one example. Even the government's own forecast released recently shows that between today and the year 2036, another 6.5 million people are forecast to enter Britain. That's equivalent to about 6 cities the size of Birmingham. Are we talking about what kind of pressure that's going to put on our public services? Of course we're not, because our politicians are only thinking about the next 3, 4, 5 years, and ultimately that lets down you, the British taxpayer. And lastly, we're not really talking about it because of the complexity of the issue. The multifaceted nature of both immigration and housing supply makes it challenging to address these issues comprehensively. But let's be honest. Politicians in Westminster aren't talking about it because they don't want to talk about it. They refuse to accept that mass immigration is driving our housing crisis by raising the cost of new homes and raising rent, especially in the big cities and the suburbs. And the people who will ultimately pay for all of this will not be the elites who often live in pretty secure, affluent neighbourhoods. It will be you, hard-working, ordinary people. Now, I think Nigel Farage is going to really play a big role in this debate because Nigel Farage and his Reform Party are already applying pressure on the big parties. Known for their outspoken views on immigration, they have consistently argued that mass immigration is a primary driver of the UK's housing crisis. This should not be controversial, by the way. In places like Canada, Sweden, Germany and Denmark, many politicians, like Justin Trudeau, for example, now publicly accept that mass immigration is not working when it comes to public services and infrastructure. Why? Because it's pushing countries into what we call a population trap. That's what happens when your population expands at such a speed and such a scale that it exceeds the capacity of the state to provide basic public services like housing, like safe streets, like a functioning national health service, like GP appointments. Let me just be straight with you for a minute. You can have available, affordable housing, or you can have mass, uncontrolled immigration. You can't have both. This is why Nigel Farage and Reform and others, including me, by the way, are arguing that uncontrolled mass immigration is making it impossible for us to plan effectively for our housing needs and resolve this crisis. The other key point here is that this strain on housing is disproportionately impacting not the elites in Westminster, but ordinary working class people. Let's be honest. It's the working class who are being completely screwed over by the policy of mass immigration, because it's not only being used to support big business and globalist corporations who want cheap migrant labor because it keeps their costs low and their profits high, but in turn it's also then impacting public services and housing, which is disproportionately impacting in a negative way ordinary working class people who have to compete with migrants for new homes, for social housing, and for places and treatments on the National Health Service and with their local GPs. So let me be clear, reducing net migration is now essential to addressing the housing crisis in modern Britain. The relationship between mass immigration and the housing crisis is complex, but it's also undeniable. While immigration brings us some benefits, its impact on housing cannot be ignored. As Farage and myself have argued, addressing the housing crisis effectively requires an honest assessment of immigration levels and their consequences on infrastructure and public services. Looking ahead, we have to balance the economic benefits of immigration, or at least controlled high-skill migration at a much lower level than the disastrous policy that we're pursuing at the moment, with the need for a sustainable population growth that does not outpace our ability to provide housing for British people, British families, and British young people. Only by confronting this challenge head on can we ever hope to resolve this housing crisis and ensure a stable, prosperous future for us all. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Let's keep challenging those conventional myths and those wisdoms in Westminster, because they're so often wrong. Matt Goodwin, see you soon.